In the quiet spaces between what we know and what we've forgotten, ancient wisdom sleeps beneath layers of dust and time, carved into stone that has weathered millennia, written on papyrus that crumbles at the slightest touch, encoded in symbols. We can barely decipher the greatest treasures of human knowledge rest hidden in plain sight. They whisper from museum walls, from archaeological sites cordoned off by velvet ropes, from libraries where scholars tread softly among brittle pages. These secrets wait patiently, like stars visible only to those who know exactly where to look in the vast darkness of what we've lost. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and your mind prepares for rest, let us walk together through the shadows of history, tracing the footsteps of those who knew things we are only beginning to remember, touching the edges of wisdom that was once as common as breathing, now as precious as dreams. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. The great library of Alexandria stood like a beacon of learning in the ancient world, its marble columns reaching toward the Mediterranean sky, its corridors echoing with the whispered conversations of scholars from every corner of the known world. But the true marvel was not the building itself, magnificent though it was, but the extraordinary collection of knowledge that filled its countless room scrolls and codices containing the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. Mathematical theorems that would not be rediscovered for centuries, astronomical observations that mapped the heavens with startling precision, and medical texts that detailed surgical procedures lost to the modern world until very recently. Within those hallowed halls, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth using nothing more than shadows and geometry, arriving at a figure so accurate that it differed from our modern measurements by mere percentage points. His method was elegantly simple, observing that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun cast no shadow in the southern city of Syene, while in Alexandria to the north, it cast a measurable shadow. By measuring the angle of that shadow and knowing the distance between the two cities, he unlocked one of the planet's most fundamental secrets. This knowledge was not hidden in some secret vault. It was taught openly, discussed freely, built upon by generations of students who walked those same marble floors. Yet somehow, this wisdom slipped away from us like water through cupped hands. The decline of Alexandria was not a single catastrophic event, but a slow hemorrhaging of knowledge. Each generation a little less curious, a little less capable of understanding what their predecessors had known. The scrolls grew brittle, the copying became careless, the questions stopped being asked. By the time the library's final flames were extinguished, whether by Christian zealots, Muslim conquerors, or simple neglect matters less than the fact. Of the loss itself, centuries of accumulated wisdom had already faded into memory. But knowledge, once discovered, has a peculiar way of surviving even the most determined attempts to destroy it. Hidden in the margins of seemingly unrelated texts, embedded in architectural proportions, encoded in the measurements of ancient monuments, the wisdom of Alexandria scattered like seeds on the wind. Medieval Islamic scholars preserved fragments in their commentaries on Aristotle. Byzantine monks copied mathematical treatises without understanding their significance. Renaissance architects unknowingly applied principles of proportion that had once been taught systematically in Alexandria's halls. Today, archaeologists sifting through the underwater ruins off Alexandria's coast occasionally surface with pottery, shards bearing calculations, with fragments of maps showing trade routes that connected Africa to India to China. Marine archaeologists have discovered harbor engineering that demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of hydraulics and materials science. The knowledge is still there, written in stone and bronze, and the very layout of the ancient city, waiting for us to remember how to read it. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, that bronze marvel of ancient Greek engineering discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Crete. For decades after its discovery in 1901, scholars could make little sense of its intricate gearing system. It looked like the remnants of a clock. But no one in the ancient world was supposed to have possessed such sophisticated mechanical knowledge. Only in recent decades, with the aid of advanced imaging technology, have we begun to understand that this device was an astronomical computer of extraordinary complexity, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking the positions of planets, and mapping the cycles of Olympic Games decades into the future. The mechanism represents a tradition of mechanical engineering that must have flourished for generations before producing such a masterpiece. There were workshops where craftsmen learned to cut bronze gears with microscopic precision, schools where mathematicians calculated the complex ratios needed to model planetary motion, traditions of astronomical observation that stretched back centuries. All of this knowledge existed, was taught, was improved upon, was used to create devices that would not seem out of place in a modern laboratory. And then it vanished so completely that when the mechanism was first discovered, respected, scholars declared it must be a much later intrusion into the ancient wreck, because such technology simply could not have existed in the classical world. This pattern repeats throughout history, sophisticated knowledge that seems impossible for its time, yet which clearly existed, was used, was understood by communities of scholars and craftsmen who have left traces of their work scattered across the ancient world. In Damascus, medieval smiths forged steel of such quality that modern metallurgists still struggled to replicate their techniques. The secret lay not in any single innovation, but in a complex understanding of temperature, timing, chemical composition, and quenching methods that took generations to perfect and could be lost in a single generation if the masters failed to train their successors properly. The Roman concrete that still stands after 2 millennia in the Pantheon's dome contains ingredients and proportions that modern engineers are only beginning to understand. Recent analysis reveals that Roman builders incorporated volcanic ash in precisely calculated ratios, creating a chemical reaction that actually strengthened the concrete over time rather than weakening it. This was not accidental discovery, but systematic engineering based on centuries of experimentation and observation. Roman architects understood principles of materials, science that were forgotten after the empire's fall and are only now being rediscovered through advanced chemical analysis. In the quiet halls of the Vatican Library, scholars occasionally encounter manuscripts that hint at knowledge systems we've lost entirely. A 13th century text describes a method for calculating compound interest that would not be formally redeveloped until the Renaissance. A Byzantine medical manual details surgical procedures for cataract removal that were not attempted again in Europe until the 18th century. These are not isolated discoveries, but fragments of comprehensive knowledge traditions that once flourished and then faded from memory long before Columbus set sail into the unknown Atlantic. Mapmakers in ancient Constantinople, Baghdad, and Cordoba possessed charts that depicted coastlines, islands, and continental outlines with startling accuracy. These were not crude approximations, but sophisticated cartographic works that demonstrated intimate knowledge of global geography. The Piri race map of 1513, compiled from much older sources that have since vanished, shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable precision, despite the fact that Antarctica would not be officially discovered until 1820, and its ice-free coastline would not be mapped until the advent of modern sonar technology. The implications are staggering. Somewhere in the archives of history, there existed maps based on actual exploration of Antarctica before the ice sheets formed, or on surveying techniques so sophisticated they could map continental outlines through hundreds of feet of ice. These were not lucky guesses or mythical constructions, but working documents used by navigators who sailed routes we thought were impossible for their era. Medieval Arab geographers possessed world maps that showed the true proportions of Africa, centuries before European explorers rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Al-Idrisi's world map, created in Sicily in 1154, depicts the African continent with an accuracy that suggests direct surveying rather than theoretical speculation. The map shows the source of the Nile, the correct relationship between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and coastal details that would not be verified by European explorers until the 15th century. These mapmakers drew upon sources that reached back into antiquity. Arab scholars frequently cite ancient Greek sources and maps from the time of Alexander when describing their cartographic references, but Alexander's own geographers were working from even older traditions. Herodotus mentions maps that showed the Caspian Sea as an inland body of water, fact that European geographers got wrong for centuries after the classical period ended, depicting it as a bay of the Arctic Ocean until Russian exploration proved otherwise. The accuracy of ancient navigation becomes even more mysterious when we consider the Phoenician trade networks that spanned the known world and reached far beyond it. Phoenician traders left inscriptions in Brazil, coins in the Americas, and genetic traces in populations from Cornwall to Ceylon. Their ships, propelled by nothing more sophisticated than wind and human muscle, somehow navigated with precision across trackless oceans, finding tiny islands in vast expanses of water, returning to ports thousands of miles away with cargoes of goods that could only have come from specific, distant locations. This navigation required not just courage, but sophisticated knowledge, understanding of star positions, ocean currents, wind patterns, seasonal variations, and landmark recognition that took generations to accumulate. The Phoenicians developed lodestones for magnetic navigation, calculated distances using water clocks and sand timers, and maintained oral traditions that preserved navigational knowledge with the precision of mathematical formulas. But perhaps, most remarkably, they possessed maps. Not the crude sketch maps that we might expect from an ancient culture, but detailed charts that showed ocean depths, seasonal current patterns, safe harbors, and reliable sources of fresh water. These maps were trade secrets, passed down within families of navigators, copied and updated with each voyage, refined through generations of practical experience. When the Phoenician civilization faded, their maps scattered. Some ended up in Carthaginian archives and were later copied by Roman scholars. Others found their way to Alexandria, where Greek geographers incorporated Phoenician discoveries into their own theoretical frameworks. Still others were preserved by Jewish scholars who maintained Phoenician traditions even after the cities themselves fell to foreign conquerors. Medieval Arab scholars, who had access to libraries in Damascus, Baghdad, and Cordoba that preserved texts from multiple ancient traditions, frequently mentioned charts and maps derived from Phoenician sources. They describe sea routes to islands in the Atlantic, trading posts on African coasts, and harbors in distant lands that would not appear on European maps until the age of exploration began in earnest. The famous tabula Rogeriana, created by Alexandria for King Roger II of Sicily, synthesized geographic knowledge from Greek, Arab, and what he called ancient maritime sources to create a world map of unprecedented accuracy. The map showed not just coastlines, but interior features, mountain ranges, river systems, desert boundaries, and political divisions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of regions that European scholars considered completely unknown. Consider the Icelandic Sagas, which describe Viking voyages to Vinland, clearly identifiable as North America, with navigational details so precise that modern sailors have successfully followed their directions to reach the exact locations described. In the texts, the sagas mention landmarks, seasonal patterns, and coastal features that could only have been recorded by people who had actually made these journeys multiple times and maintained detailed records of their observations. But the Vikings, skilled navigators though they were, built upon even older traditions. Their navigation techniques incorporated knowledge borrowed from Celtic sailors, who in turn had learned from Roman merchants, who had studied under Greek teachers, who claimed their knowledge came from Phoenician sources. Each generation added observations and refinements, but the core body of navigational knowledge reached back into the deep past, to maritime traditions that may have originated when the world's geography was significantly different from what we know today. In 1929, a German scholar named Athanasius Kircher published reproductions of ancient maps he had discovered in Jesuit archives. These maps, supposedly copied from much older sources, showed the Atlantic Ocean with islands and landmasses that do not appear on any modern chart. Some scholars dismissed them as medieval fantasies, but recent oceanographic research has revealed that sea levels were significantly lower during various periods of human history, and that land masses, which are now submerged, would have been above water and habitable during these periods. The Azores, Canary Islands, and other Atlantic archipelagos show clear evidence of human habitation long before their supposed discovery by medieval European explorers. Stone buildings, agricultural terraces, and harbor installations on these islands demonstrate knowledge of sophisticated construction techniques and suggest regular contact with mainland civilizations. The islands were not isolated discoveries, but waypoints on established trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, and possibly the Americas in a vast network of maritime commerce. Recent underwater archaeology has revealed submerged ruins off coastlines around the world, stone structures, harbor installations, and road systems that extend beneath the waves to depths that indicate they were built when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. These are not natural formations, but clearly artificial constructions that required planning, engineering, and maintenance by organized societies. The existence of these ruins implies that our ancestors possessed not just local geographic knowledge, but global understanding of sea level changes, climate patterns, and geological processes. They built cities and harbors in locations that would be optimal for their purposes during specific historical periods, suggesting long-term planning based on sophisticated understanding of environmental change. In the pre-dawn darkness of ancient Babylon, priest astronomers climbed ziggurats to observe the dance of planets against the backdrop of stars, recording their movements with mathematical precision that would not be equaled until the invention of mechanical clocks. These observations, meticulously recorded on cuneiform tablets that have survived for millennia, reveal astronomical knowledge of breathtaking sophistication. The Babylonians calculated the length of the year to within minutes of our modern measurements, predicted eclipses centuries in advance, and tracked planetary cycles with accuracy that required continuous observation over hundreds of years. Their astronomical records were not mere curiosities, but practical tools for a civilization that lived according to cosmic rhythms. They developed mathematical systems for predicting when the Nile would flood, when to plant crops, when to hold religious festivals, and when to conduct important diplomatic missions. This knowledge was encoded in mathematical tables that represented centuries of accumulated observation, passed down through generations of specialists who dedicated their lives to understanding the movements of celestial bodies. But the Babylonians were building upon even older traditions. Sumerian astronomers had already identified and named most of the constellations we recognize today, had calculated the precession of the equinoxes, and had developed a lunar calendar so accurate that it required only minor adjustments every few centuries. Their mathematical astronomy was not primitive stargazing, but systematic science, based on theoretical frameworks that could predict celestial events with remarkable precision. The astronomical knowledge, preserved in ancient Indian texts, surpasses even Babylonian achievements in some areas. The Surya Siddhanta, an ancient Sanskrit treatise on astronomy, contains calculations of planetary distances and orbital periods that match modern measurements with startling accuracy. The text describes the Earth as a sphere suspended in space, calculates its circumference to within 1% of the correct value, and provides mathematical methods for determining the positions of planets centuries in the future. Indian astronomers understood concepts that would not be formally developed in European science until the Renaissance. They calculated the speed of light, understood that the moon's illumination came from reflected sunlight, and knew that eclipses were caused by the shadows of celestial bodies rather than supernatural intervention. Their mathematical astronomy was so sophisticated that medieval Arab scholars traveled to India, specifically to study their methods, and translated their works into Arabic for preservation and further development. Perhaps most remarkably, ancient Indian texts describe astronomical phenomena that occur on timescales far longer than any individual human lifetime. They discuss cycles of cosmic time that span millions of years, describe the precession of the equinoxes as part of vast cosmic cycles, and provide mathematical methods for calculating planetary positions across these enormous time periods. This knowledge could only have been developed through systematic observation and record-keeping that continued for thousands of years, with each generation building upon the work of their predecessors. In the highlands of Peru, the Nazca lines stretch across the desert landscape in patterns that become clear only when viewed from high altitude. These enormous drawings, created by removing dark surface stones to reveal lighter earth beneath, form geometric shapes, animal figures, and straight lines that extend for miles across the desert floor. For decades, scholars debated their purpose, until careful astronomical analysis revealed that many of the lines point directly toward sunrise and sunset positions on significant dates, toward the rising and setting points of important stars, and toward lunar extremes that occur only once every 18 years. The Nazca lines represent astronomical knowledge encoded in landscape architecture. Their creators understood not just the basic movements of sun, moon, and stars, but subtle variations that occur over decades and centuries. They could predict which stars would be visible at specific times of year, where the sun would rise on the solstices and equinoxes, and how the moon's path across the sky would change over the course of its complex cycles. This astronomical knowledge was not theoretical, but intensely practical. The Nazca culture depended on accurate timing for agricultural activities in one of the world's most challenging environments. Their desert homeland received almost no rainfall, so they relied on underground water sources fed by seasonal snowmelt in distant mountains. Knowing exactly when these water sources would be replenished required precise understanding of seasonal cycles, mountain weather patterns, and the relationship between celestial events and terrestrial changes. Similar astronomical alignments have been discovered at sites around the world. Stonehenge in England, Newgrange in Ireland, Gozek Circle in Germany, and dozens of other ancient monuments demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. These are not crude sun calendars, but complex observational instruments that tracked multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously, predicted eclipses, and marked important celestial events with mathematical precision. The builders of these monuments possessed knowledge that we're only beginning to appreciate. Recent computer analysis of Stonehenge has revealed that its complex arrangement of stones creates multiple astronomical alignments that function like a mechanical computer, allowing observers to predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and calculate calendar dates centuries in advance. The monument encodes astronomical knowledge so sophisticated that medieval European astronomers could not have duplicated its calculations without advanced mathematical training. Ancient Egyptian pyramids demonstrate equally sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy that was not equaled until the invention of modern surveying instruments. Its internal passages point toward specific stars that were significant in Egyptian religious and astronomical traditions. The pyramid's proportions encode mathematical relationships that reflect accurate knowledge of Earth's dimensions, the length of the year, and the relationship between solar and stellar timekeeping systems. But Egyptian astronomical knowledge extended far beyond pyramid construction. Papyrus texts describe mathematical methods for calculating the positions of planets, predict eclipses, and determine the optimal timing for agricultural activities. Egyptian astronomers understood that the year was slightly longer than 365 days, and developed correction methods to keep their calendars synchronized with seasonal changes. They identified and named most of the stars and constellations that we recognize today and created star maps that were used for navigation by both land and sea. The astronomical knowledge preserved in these ancient traditions represents collaborative work by hundreds of generations of observers. Each generation refined the observations of their predecessors, corrected errors, and added new discoveries. The mathematical tables used by Babylonian astronomers were continuously updated for over 1,000 years. Indian astronomical texts show clear evidence of revision and improvement across multiple centuries. Egyptian star calendars became increasingly sophisticated over the course of millennia. This collaborative approach to astronomical observation created bodies of knowledge that no single individual or even single civilization could have developed independently. The accuracy of ancient astronomical calculations required datasets spanning centuries. Mathematical techniques developed through generations of refinement, and observational methods that could detect extremely subtle celestial phenomena. When these traditions began to fade, their knowledge scattered like stars across the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. Greek scholars learned from Egyptian priests. Arab astronomers studied Indian mathematical methods, and European monks preserved fragments of classical astronomical texts without fully understanding their significance. The knowledge survived, but in fragmented form, its original context and systematic development lost to later generations who inherited the results without understanding the methods that had produced them. Today, archaeoastronomers use computer programs to reconstruct ancient skies, tracing the paths of planets and stars as they appeared thousands of years ago. These reconstructions reveal that ancient astronomical alignments were far more sophisticated than previously understood. Monuments that seemed to have only basic solar orientations actually tracked complex stellar movements, planetary cycles, and lunar phenomena that required decades of careful observation to detect. The deeper we dig into ancient astronomical knowledge, the more sophisticated it appears. Recent analysis of Mayan astronomical texts has revealed mathematical methods for predicting planetary positions that were more accurate than European calculations until the invention of the telescope. Chinese astronomical records, maintained continuously for over 2 millennia, contain observations of supernova, comets, and variable stars that provide modern astronomers with invaluable data about long-term celestial phenomena. Ancient astronomers were not primitive skywatchers, but sophisticated scientists who developed mathematical tools, observational techniques, and theoretical frameworks that allowed them to understand celestial mechanics with remarkable precision. Their knowledge was encoded in monuments, preserved in texts, and embedded in cultural traditions that maintained astronomical accuracy across hundreds of generations. This was science in its purest form. Careful observation, mathematical analysis, and theoretical development carried out by communities of scholars who dedicated their lives to understanding the cosmos. As night deepens and the stars emerge in their ancient patterns, we can still see the same celestial phenomena that captured the attention of those early astronomers. The same planets that Babylonian priests tracked still follow their predictable paths across the sky. The same stars that guided Egyptian navigators still point toward true north. The same moon that Mayan astronomers studied with such devotion still marks the passage of months and seasons with mathematical regularity. Their knowledge remains hidden in plain sight, encoded in the very structures they built, preserved in the texts they wrote, embedded in the calculations they performed. Modern astronomy, for all its technological sophistication, builds upon foundations laid by these ancient observers whose names we may never know, but whose intellectual achievements continue to guide our understanding of the universe around us. Monasteries rose like beacons of learning across the darkening landscape of Europe, their stone walls harboring treasures that would have been lost forever to the chaos of collapsing empires and roving armies. In the hushed chambers of Monte Cassino, where shadows danced with candlelight across vellum pages, Brother Marcus bent over his copying desk with the devotion of a pilgrim approaching sacred ground. His weathered fingers traced the Latin words of Aristotle's lost treatise on comedy, one of only 3 copies known to exist in all of Christendom. The year was 847, and outside these walls, Vikings sailed up rivers like harbingers of destruction, while kingdoms crumbled into dust. Yet here, in this sanctuary of silence, the accumulated wisdom of ages found refuge. The monastic tradition of preservation began not with grand proclamations or royal decrees, but with the quiet understanding that knowledge, like a flame, must be carefully tended or it dies. When the last schools of Athens closed their doors in 429, when the great library of Alexandria finally succumbed to neglect and conflict, it seemed as though the intellectual achievements of antiquity would vanish like morning mist. But the monks understood something profound about the nature of survival, that sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in the patient copying of a single manuscript on a winter night. Brother Marcus was part of a chain that stretched across centuries, each link forged by careful hands and illuminated minds. In Ireland, monks on windswept islands transcribed texts with such meticulous care that their copies would outlast the originals by 1,000 years. At Cluny, scribes worked by the light of whale oil lamps, their dedication so complete that they developed new techniques for preserving parchment that would puzzle historians for generations. These were not merely copyists, but guardians of a sacred trust, understanding that each word they preserved might be the only thing standing between human knowledge and eternal darkness. The monasteries became inadvertent time capsules, preserving not only the great works of philosophy and science, but also the smaller details that revealed how people actually lived and thought. In the margins of copied manuscripts, scribes left notes that read like whispered conversations across centuries. "This passage troubles me," wrote one anonymous monk beside a section of Augustine's Confessions. The author seems to suggest that memory itself is a kind of prayer. Another scribe, working on a copy of Pliny's Natural History, added his own observations about the behavior of bees, creating an informal scientific dialogue that would influence later naturalists without them ever knowing the source. The preservation efforts extended beyond mere copying. In the scriptorium of St. Gall, monks developed what they called the Codex Perpetuus, a system of creating multiple copies of crucial texts and distributing them to sister monasteries. Across Europe, this early form of redundant storage meant that even if one monastery fell to raiders or fire, the knowledge it contained would survive elsewhere. The monks understood, perhaps better than any librarian before or since, that true preservation required not just careful copying, but strategic distribution. As Brother Marcus completed his copy of Aristotle's treatise, he had no way of knowing that his careful work would eventually find its way to the court of Charlemagne, where it would influence the emperor's educational reforms, or that centuries later it would surface in the private library of a Venetian merchant, helping to spark the intellectual revival that would become the Renaissance. The knowledge hidden in plain sight within monastery walls was playing a longer game than anyone could imagine. While European monasteries preserved the classical tradition through patient copying, in the bustling markets and marble corridors of Baghdad, a different kind of preservation was taking place, one that involved not just saving ancient knowledge, but expanding it, questioning it, and weaving it into new patterns of understanding that would reshape human thought. The House of Wisdom, established in the early 9th century by the Abbasid caliphs, became the greatest center of learning the world had seen since Alexandria. But unlike the great library of the Ptolemies, which was primarily a repository, the House of Wisdom was a living laboratory where scholars from every corner of the known world gathered to not merely preserve knowledge, but to push it forward into uncharted territories. Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Muqaddasi walked through the translation halls where teams of scholars worked in a symphony of intellectual collaboration that would be impossible to recreate today. Here, a Christian monk from Syria worked alongside a Jewish mathematician from Cairo and a Persian astronomer from Samarkand, all united by their hunger for understanding. The air hummed with the sound of different languages as translators worked to render Greek treatises into Arabic, Persian astronomical texts into Latin, and Sanskrit mathematical works into forms that could be understood across cultural boundaries. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad represented more than mere linguistic conversion. It was a sophisticated process of cultural synthesis that created new knowledge even as it preserved old wisdom. When the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi worked on his translation of Ptolemy's Almagest, he didn't simply render the Greek into Arabic. He corrected errors, added his own observations, and integrated Indian mathematical techniques that resulted in astronomical calculations of unprecedented accuracy. The translation became a new work entirely, one that would guide navigators and astronomers for centuries to come. The scholars of Baghdad understood that knowledge was not a static treasure to be hoarded, but a living thing that grew stronger through use and exchange. In the medical schools attached to the House of Wisdom, physicians like Al-Razi systematically recorded their observations of diseases and treatments, creating case studies that built upon Galenic theory while challenging its limitations. Their detailed records of surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques were hidden in plain sight within larger medical treatises, waiting for future generations to recognize their revolutionary implications. Perhaps nowhere was this synthetic approach more evident than in the work of the philosopher Al-Kindi, who recognized that the preservation of ancient wisdom required more than careful copying. It demanded critical evaluation and creative integration. His treatises on optics drew from Greek geometry, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics to create new understanding of light and vision that would eventually influence Roger Bacon and later Johannes Kepler. Al-Kindi's work was hidden in plain sight within the broader Islamic philosophical tradition, its full significance only becoming apparent when Renaissance scholars began to trace the lineage of their own discoveries. The House of Wisdom also became a center for what we might now call reverse engineering, the careful study of ancient texts to understand not just what their authors knew, but how they knew it. When the Persian mathematician Al-Biruni encountered references to ancient Indian astronomical techniques in badly damaged Sanskrit manuscripts, he didn't simply accept the calculations at face value. Instead, he worked backward from the results to reconstruct the mathematical methods, often discovering elegant solutions that surpassed the original techniques in precision and efficiency. This culture of intellectual curiosity extended beyond the formal institutions to the streets and markets of Baghdad itself. Travelers returning from distant lands brought not only goods for trade, but stories, techniques, and ideas that found their way into the scholarly discussions of the House of Wisdom. A merchant who had observed shipbuilding techniques in Indian ocean ports might find himself in conversation with a naval engineer studying Archimedes' principles of buoyancy. A diplomat returning from the Byzantine court might carry descriptions of new architectural techniques that would influence treatises on engineering and mathematics. The knowledge preserved and created in Baghdad was often hidden in the most ordinary places. Al-Jazari's mechanical treatises, which described water clocks and automated devices of stunning sophistication, were written as practical handbooks for court engineers. Only much later would scholars recognize them as foundational texts in the development of mechanical engineering. Similarly, the agricultural manuals produced by Islamic scholars contained innovations in irrigation, crop rotation, and soil management that wouldn't be fully appreciated until the European agricultural revolution of the 18th century in the mountain passes of medieval Spain, where Christian, Islamic, and Jewish cultures met and mingled in an extraordinary confluence of learning. Knowledge flowed like water, finding its level across seemingly impossible barriers. The city of Toledo became the greatest translation center in medieval Europe, a place where the accumulated wisdom of centuries was not just preserved, but transformed through the alchemy of cultural exchange. Gerard of Cremona arrived in Toledo, In 1167, with a scholar's desperate hunger for knowledge, he had come seeking a single text Alomes Almagest, but what he found in the libraries and schools of this remarkable city was something far more valuable, a living tradition of intellectual synthesis that had been hidden in plain sight beneath the surface conflicts of medieval politics. Gerard would spend the rest of his life in Toledo, translating more than 70 works from Arabic into Latin. But his greatest contribution was not any single translation, but his role in establishing a methodology for scholarly transmission that would reshape European learning. The translation schools of Toledo operated on principles that seem startlingly modern in their recognition of cultural complexity. Rather than working alone, translators typically formed teams that included native speakers of both source and target languages, subject matter experts who understood the technical content, and cultural interpreters who could navigate the subtle differences in worldview that shaped how knowledge was expressed and understood. A typical translation project might involve a Jewish scholar who understood both Arabic and Hebrew, a Christian monk trained in Latin theological terminology, and a Muslim intellectual who could explain the cultural context that gave technical terms their precise meaning. This collaborative approach led to translations that were often more than simple linguistic conversions. They became cultural bridges that carried not just information, but entire ways of thinking across the boundaries that divided medieval society. When the team working on Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle encountered passages that had no direct equivalent in Latin philosophical vocabulary, they didn't simply invent new terms. Instead, they created elaborate footnotes and marginal commentaries that explained not just what the Arabic text said, but how it fit into broader patterns of Islamic thought, how it related to Jewish interpretive traditions, and where it might conflict with Christian theological assumptions. The knowledge that emerged from these translation centers was often hidden within seemingly familiar texts. European scholars reading Latin translations of Aristotle from the Toledo schools thought they were encountering pure Greek philosophy, not realizing that what they were actually reading was a sophisticated synthesis that included centuries of Islamic commentary, Jewish interpretation, and Christian theological adaptation. The Aristotle that influenced Thomas Aquinas and other medieval scholastics was actually a collaborative creation of dozens of translators and commentators working across cultural boundaries over several centuries. The hidden nature of this cultural synthesis created one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of knowledge transmission. When European universities began to develop their curriculum around the newly discovered works of Aristotle and other classical authors, they were actually building their intellectual foundations on texts that had been preserved, expanded, and refined by the very cultures they were often in conflict with politically. The University of Paris, which saw itself as a bastion of Christian learning, was unknowingly teaching astronomy based on Islamic mathematical techniques, medicine derived from Arabic synthesis of Greek and Persian traditions, and philosophy that bore the invisible fingerprints of Jewish and Muslim commentators. This hidden circulation of knowledge created networks of influence that operated independently of political and religious boundaries. A mathematical technique developed in 9th century Baghdad might travel through Cordoba and Toledo to appear in a 13th century European monastery, where it would be applied to architectural problems that its original creators could never have imagined. A medical procedure perfected in the hospitals of Cairo might find its way into European practice through a chain of translations and personal contacts that crossed every major cultural boundary of the medieval world. The scholars working in these translation centers understood that they were participating in something larger than simple text conversion. They saw themselves as links in a chain of transmission that stretched back to ancient Greece and forward to an uncertain future. Their careful work was guided by the understanding that knowledge, once lost, might never be recovered, but that knowledge properly preserved and transmitted could grow and flourish in ways that transcended the limitations of any single culture or historical moment. In the private study of Poggio Bracciolin, surrounded by manuscripts rescued from crumbling monastery libraries across Europe, the Renaissance was taking shape one rediscovered text at a time. The year was 1417, and Poggio had just returned from a journey that would change the course of European thought. Though neither he nor his contemporaries fully understood the significance of what he had accomplished, hidden within the dusty collections of remote German monasteries, he had found works that had been lost to European scholarship for centuries. Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, complete works of Cicero, architectural treatises that would inspire Brunelleschi's revolutionary dome for Florence Cathedral. But Poggio's discoveries were more than simple recoveries of ancient texts. In the margins of these manuscripts, he found evidence of continuous intellectual engagement that revealed how knowledge had survived and evolved during the centuries when it was supposedly lost. Monks had added their own observations to classical texts on natural philosophy. Arab numerals appeared in manuscripts copied centuries before such notation was supposedly introduced to Europe. Astronomical calculations showed clear evidence of Islamic mathematical techniques being used by Christian scholars who may not have even realized the ultimate source of their methods. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning was, in many ways, a rediscovery of knowledge that had never actually been lost, only hidden beneath layers of cultural assumption and scholarly neglect. The humanist scholars who prided themselves on returning to pure classical sources were often working with texts that had been preserved and transmitted through exactly the kind of medieval synthesis they claimed to reject. The original Plato they celebrated had survived because Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Averroes had found his ideas worth preserving and developing. The Aristotle they placed at the center of their universities had been maintained by the very scholastic tradition they sought to reform. Leo Ficino's Platonic Academy in Florence became a center for this complex process of rediscovery and reinterpretation. Working in the villa provided by Cosimo de' Medici, Ficino and his collaborators created new translations of Platonic and Neoplatonic texts that aimed to recover the original spirit of ancient philosophy. But their work revealed something unexpected. Many of the ideas they thought were revolutionary rediscoveries had actually been current in medieval, Islamic and Jewish thought for centuries. The concept of the immortality of the soul, the relationship between reason and revelation, the possibility of achieving direct knowledge of divine truth, of these had been explored in sophisticated detail by thinkers like Maimonides, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali. This realization led to one of the most intellectually honest moments in Renaissance scholarship. Rather than claiming exclusive originality, scholars like Pico della Mirandola began to trace the hidden lineages that connected their work to earlier traditions. Pico's famous oration on the dignity of man explicitly acknowledges its debt. Two Jewish Kabbalistic texts, Islamic philosophical works, and Christian mystical traditions. His 900 Theses, intended to demonstrate the underlying unity of all knowledge, were actually an elaborate exercise in revealing the hidden connections that linked apparently disparate intellectual traditions. The printing revolution that began in the mid-15th century accelerated this process of rediscovery and circulation. But the early printers understood that their role was not simply mechanical reproduction. They were cultural curators making crucial decisions about which texts deserved preservation and circulation. Aldus Manutius, printing in Venice, chose to publish not just Greek classics, but also Arabic mathematical texts in Latin translation, Jewish philosophical works, and contemporary humanist writings that drew explicit connections between ancient wisdom and modern insight. The knowledge hidden in these early printed books often existed in the relationships between texts rather than within any single work. A reader who owned Manutius's edition of Aristotle's Metaphysics, Ficino's translation of the Hermetic Corpus, and Pico's oration would encounter, perhaps without fully realizing it, a conversation that spanned more than 1,000 years and included voices from across the Mediterranean world. The revolutionary ideas of the Renaissance were often syntheses of ideas that had been developing in parallel across different cultural traditions, waiting for a historical moment when the barriers between those traditions became sufficiently permeable to allow for open intellectual exchange. In the workshops of Renaissance artists and engineers, this hidden knowledge took on practical form. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks reveal a mind that drew inspiration from classical mechanical texts, Islamic optical theories, and medieval treatises on anatomy and engineering. His famous flying machine designs show clear influence from Al-Giza mechanical devices, while his anatomical studies build upon the work of Islamic physicians like Ar-Razi and Ibn Sina. The Renaissance ideal of the universal genius was actually an embodiment of the synthetic approach to knowledge that had been developing in Islamic and Jewish scholarly traditions for centuries. The astronomical work of Copernicus provides perhaps the clearest example of how Renaissance discoveries were often rediscoveries of knowledge that had been preserved in hidden form. Copernicus's revolutionary assertion that the Earth orbited the Sun was indeed revolutionary in the context of European astronomy. But similar models had been proposed and developed by Islamic astronomers like al-Biruni and al-Shirazi centuries earlier. The mathematical techniques Copernicus used to demonstrate his theory had been preserved in Arabic astronomical texts that were beginning to circulate in Latin translation during his lifetime. What made the Renaissance genuinely revolutionary was not the recovery of lost knowledge, but the development of new methods for integrating and building upon inherited wisdom. Renaissance scholars learned to see knowledge as something that could be improved through critical examination, rather than simply preserved through faithful transmission. They developed techniques for comparing different versions of the same text, for tracing the historical development of ideas, and for testing ancient theories against contemporary observation and experience. By the end of the 15th century, the accumulated knowledge of centuries had been not merely preserved, but transformed into something new. The hidden wisdom that had survived in monastery libraries, Islamic scholarly institutions, and Jewish communities across the Mediterranean had been brought into open conversation. The result was not just a recovery of classical learning, but the creation of new intellectual traditions that would reshape European thought and eventually influence the entire world. The knowledge had been hidden in plain sight all along, had simply been waiting for a historical moment when the boundaries between different traditions of learning became sufficiently permeable to allow for the kind of synthesis that would define the modern era. These precious manuscripts would soon find themselves at the center of a new intellectual movement that would reshape how humanity approached the very concept of knowledge itself. As the 17th century dawned across Europe, a profound shift began to stir in the minds of scholars and thinkers who had grown weary of accepting ancient authority without question. The Enlightenment, that great flowering of human reason and scientific inquiry, emerged like dawn breaking over a landscape that had been shrouded in the comfortable shadows of tradition for too long. In the quiet chambers of the Royal Society of London, established in 1660, men gathered around polished oak tables laden with strange instruments and curious specimens. The very air seemed to hum with possibility as these natural philosophers, as they called themselves, bent their minds to understanding the world through observation rather than assumption. Francis Bacon's revolutionary idea that knowledge should be built upon empirical evidence rather than inherited wisdom had taken root, and now it flourished in ways the Renaissance humanists could never have imagined. Isaac Newton sat in his study at Trinity College, Cambridge, his quill scratching across parchment as he decoded the mathematical language in which God had written the universe. The candlelight flickered across pages filled with equations that would unlock the secrets of celestial motion, revealing that the same force that drew an apple to earth also kept the moon in its eternal dance around our world. Yet even as Newton revolutionized human understanding of the physical realm, he spent countless hours studying ancient alchemical texts, believing that the wisdom of ages past might contain truths that his mathematical proofs could not yet reveal. This paradox defined the Enlightenment's relationship with lost knowledge. While these brilliant minds championed reason and empirical observation, they remained deeply aware that much of human understanding had been scattered to the winds of time. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great German polymath, dreamed of creating a universal library that would gather all human knowledge into one magnificent repository. He spent years traveling across Europe, visiting monasteries and private collections, copying manuscripts and cataloging the intellectual treasures he discovered in dusty archives. The French philosophe took up this banner with particular enthusiasm. Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert embarked upon their monumental encyclopedia, attempting to systematize all human knowledge for the benefit of future generations. They understood, perhaps better than any generation before them, how easily wisdom could be lost in the chaos of war, the flames of fanaticism, or simply the gentle erosion of time's passage. Their massive undertaking became a race against forgetting, a determined effort to preserve and organize the scattered fragments of human tunders, understanding before they could slip away forever. In the lamplit workshops of these encyclopedists, secretaries, and scholars worked through the night, transcribing articles on everything from ancient philosophy to modern agricultural techniques. They interviewed craftsmen whose knowledge had been passed down through generations, recording the practical wisdom that had never been written down. A master blacksmith's understanding of metal temperament, a midwife's knowledge of medicinal herbs, a navigator's feel for wind and tide, all of this they recognized as legitimate knowledge worthy of preservation alongside the great philosophical treatises of antiquity. Yet even as European scholars celebrated the power of reason and scientific method, they remained acutely aware of their own limitations. The ancient libraries of Alexandria and Baghdad had contained texts they could only dream of reading. Entire schools of philosophical thought had vanished without a trace. Mathematical discoveries that might have advanced human understanding by centuries had been lost when civilizations crumbled or were conquered by those who valued different forms of knowledge. This awareness drove many Enlightenment thinkers to look beyond the borders of Christian Europe for sources of wisdom that might have been preserved elsewhere. They began to study with new intensity the philosophical traditions of Asia, the scientific achievements of the Islamic world, and the practical knowledge of indigenous peoples around the globe. This intellectual curiosity would soon intersect with the great age of European exploration and colonization, creating a complex and often tragic dynamic between the preservation and destruction of human knowledge. The wooden hulls of European ships cut through azure waters toward shores that had never felt the weight of European boots. In the holds of these vessels, alongside cannons and trade goods, traveled men whose minds burned with curiosity about the peoples and knowledge systems they would encounter in distant lands. Some came as missionaries, determined to replace what they saw as heathen ignorance with Christian truth. Others came as natural philosophers, eager to catalogue new species and study different ways of understanding the natural world. Most came seeking gold and glory, but even they could not help but be amazed by the sophisticated civilizations they discovered. When Jesuit missionaries first arrived in China during the late Ming dynasty, they found themselves face to face with a civilization whose intellectual achievements rivaled and often surpassed those of Europe. The imperial libraries of Beijing contained millions of volumes, scientific treatises that demonstrated mathematical concepts unknown to European scholars, and philosophical works that had been refined through centuries of sophisticated debate. Father Matteo Ricci, one of the first Jesuits to master Chinese, spent years studying Confucian texts and comparing them with Christian theology, creating a remarkable synthesis that enriched both traditions. That Chinese, for their part, proved equally curious about European knowledge. They welcomed Jesuit astronomers who could help reform their calendar system and admired European innovations in cartography and mechanical engineering. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though genuine intellectual exchange might flourish between East and West, with each civilization contributing its unique insights to a growing pool of human understanding. Similar encounters played out across the globe, each one a complex dance between curiosity and conquest, respect and exploitation. In India, European scholars marveled at the sophisticated mathematical texts of ancient Hindu and Buddhist traditions. They discovered that Indian mathematicians had developed the concept of zero and decimal notation centuries before these ideas reached Europe through Islamic intermediaries. Sanskrit texts revealed philosophical systems of breathtaking complexity and astronomical observations of remarkable precision. The British Orientalist Sir William Jones, working in Calcutta in the late 18th century, dedicated his life to translating and preserving these Sanskrit treasures. He founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal and gathered around him a community of scholars who recognized that they stood at the threshold of an ancient intellectual tradition that could illuminate dark corners of human understanding. Jones's translations of Hindu law, texts, and classical literature opened European minds to ways of thinking that had been developing in parallel to their own for millennia. Yet even as some Europeans worked to preserve and understand these foreign knowledge systems, others were systematically destroying them. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas encountered civilizations with their own rich intellectual traditions, but their response was often to burn libraries and suppress indigenous ways of knowing in favor of Christian doctrine and European methods. The great libraries of Tenochtitlan contained thousands of codices documenting Aztec history, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. These bark paper books, painted with intricate glyphs and colorful illustrations, represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about everything from agricultural cycles to mathematical calculations. When Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés entered the Aztec capital in 1519, he found himself in a city more magnificent than any European capital, supported by knowledge systems that had allowed the Aztecs to create floating gardens, predict eclipses, and perform surgical procedures with remarkable success. But the Spanish saw only heathen superstition where the Aztecs saw sacred knowledge. Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the destruction of countless Mayan codices in the Yucatan, believing he was striking a blow against devil worship. Only a handful of these precious documents survived the flames, leaving modern scholars with mere fragments of what must have been a vast and sophisticated intellectual tradition. The irony was profound. A civilization that prided itself on preserving and transmitting knowledge was systematically destroying the accumulated wisdom of entire cultures. The story repeated itself across the Americas. Inca Quipu, those remarkable knotted chord systems that served as both mathematical calculators and historical records, were dismissed as primitive curiosities rather than recognized as an alternative form of writing. Indigenous medicinal knowledge, developed through centuries of careful observation and experimentation, was often ignored or actively suppressed in favor of Europeans. Medical practices that were frequently less effective in local conditions. As colonial empires expanded across the globe, a new breed of European emerged, the collector of curiosities and manuscripts, who sought to preserve the intellectual treasures of conquered peoples. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, saw themselves as saviors of knowledge, rescuing precious artifacts and texts from what they perceived as the chaos and ignorance of native societies. Their motivations were complex, blending genuine scholarly interest with imperial ambition and a paternalistic belief that European institutions were the only ones capable of properly preserving and studying these treasures. Sir Hans Sloane, the Irish physician and naturalist whose collection would form the foundation of the British Museum, spent decades gathering specimens and manuscripts from every corner of the British Empire. His London home became a wonderland of preserved animals, pressed plants, ancient coins, and exotic manuscripts. Visitors could examine Aztec obsidian mirrors alongside Egyptian papyri, Chinese porcelain beside Polynesian ceremonial masks. Sloane genuinely believed that by bringing these objects together in one place, he was creating opportunities for comparative study that would advance human understanding. Yet the very act of collection was also an act of extraction. Each manuscript that found its way into a European library was one fewer text available to the culture that had created it. Indigenous communities were often left without access to their own intellectual heritage, while European scholars debated the meaning of texts they could barely comprehend without cultural context. The British Museum's manuscript collection grew fat with Sanskrit texts copied from temple libraries across India, but the temples themselves were left impoverished of their literary treasures. This pattern played out in institutions across Europe. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris filled its shelves with manuscripts gathered from French colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Royal Library in Copenhagen acquired entire collections of palm leaf manuscripts from Dutch trading posts in Southeast Asia. Each European capital became a repository of global knowledge, but at the cost of disconnecting that knowledge from the living traditions that had nurtured it. Some collectors, to their credit, recognized this paradox and attempted to address it. The French Orientalist Anquetil Parin spent years living among Zoroastrian communities in India, not only collecting their sacred texts, but also learning the languages and rituals necessary to understand them properly. He recognized that a manuscript was not simply an object to be studied, but a living part of a cultural tradition that required respect and careful attention to context. The German scholar Friedrich Max Müller, working at Oxford in the 19th century, dedicated his career to publishing critical editions of Sanskrit texts that would make them available to both European scholars and Indian intellectuals who had been cut off from their own classical traditions by centuries of political upheaval. His Sacred Books of the East series represented a genuine attempt to bridge the gap between Western scholarship and Eastern wisdom, though it still reflected the colonial assumption that European methods of study were superior to indigenous approaches. Meanwhile, in the field, colonial administrators and military officers were making their own contributions to the preservation and destruction of knowledge. Some, like the British civil servant Charles Wilkins, who produced the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita, worked tirelessly to understand and preserve the intellectual traditions of the peoples they governed. Others saw local knowledge systems as obstacles to effective administration and worked to replace them with European methods. The British destruction of indigenous education systems in India provides a particularly stark example of this destructive impulse. For centuries, India had maintained a sophisticated network of traditional schools where students learned mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy through methods refined over generations. Thomas Babington Macaulay's famous Minute on Education in 1835 dismissed this entire tradition as worthless, arguing that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The result was the systematic dismantling of educational institutions that had preserved and transmitted knowledge for over 1,000 years. Students who might have become masters of traditional medicine or astronomy were instead taught to value only European learning. Within a generation, much of this indigenous intellectual tradition had begun to wither away, as the communities that had sustained it lost confidence in their own ways of knowing. The component celebration of scientific method created new opportunities for understanding the natural world, but it also established a hierarchy of knowledge that would have profound consequences for how different cultures' intellectual achievements were valued and preserved. As European natural philosophers developed increasingly sophisticated tools for observation and measurement, they began to dismiss as unscientific any knowledge system that did not conform to their new standards of empirical proof. This dismissal was particularly tragic in the field of medicine, where indigenous healing traditions around the world had developed through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Native American healers possessed detailed knowledge of plant pharmacology that had been refined through generations of practice. African traditional doctors understood surgical techniques and disease patterns that European physicians had yet to master. Asian medical systems, like traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, had developed sophisticated theories of physiology and treatment that offered genuine alternatives to European approaches. Yet because these medical traditions were embedded in religious or philosophical systems that European scientists found incompatible with their mechanistic worldview, they were often dismissed entirely rather than studied for their potential contributions to human health. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many of these traditional healing practices were actually more effective than contemporary European medicine, which was still dominated by bloodletting and mercury treatments that often did more harm than good. Dr. James Linn's discovery of the cure for scurvy provides an instructive example of how European prejudice could blind scientists to knowledge that was hiding in plain sight. Lind, a naval surgeon, conducted what is often cited as one of the first controlled clinical trials in 1747, demonstrating that citrus fruits could prevent and cure scurvy among sailors. His discovery was hailed as a triumph of scientific method over traditional superstition. What European medical histories rarely mention is that indigenous peoples in many parts of the world had known about the anti-scurvy properties of various plants for centuries. Native Americans regularly treated scurvy with pine needle tea, and many other cultures had developed their own plant-based remedies for the disease. European sailors, however, preferred to die of scurvy rather than learn from savage medicine, and it took the authority of a European doctor conducting a formal experiment to make this knowledge acceptable to Western medicine. The botanist Carl Linnaeus, famous for his system of biological classification, represents both the promise and the limitation of Enlightenment approaches to knowledge. His taxonomic system provided a valuable framework for organizing information about the natural world, and he genuinely sought to catalog plant knowledge from around the globe. His students traveled to every continent, collecting specimens and learning about local uses for different plants. Yet, Linnaeus's system also imposed European categories and naming conventions on knowledge systems that had their own sophisticated ways of organizing information about the natural world. Indigenous peoples who had been studying their local ecosystems for thousands of years found their deep understanding reduced to brief notations in European botanical texts. The complex relationships between plants, animals, and human communities that formed the foundation of traditional ecological knowledge were simplified into lists of taxonomic characteristics that missed much of what made this knowledge truly valuable. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, established in 1759, became a symbol of this complex relationship between preservation and appropriation. The gardens served as a repository for plants from across the British Empire, and the scientists who worked there made genuine contributions to botanical knowledge. They preserved many species that might otherwise have been lost to habitat destruction, and documented plant uses that might have disappeared as traditional communities were disrupted by colonial expansion. At the same time, Kew also served the economic interests of the empire, helping to identify plants that could be profitably cultivated in different colonial territories. The transfer of rubber trees from Brazil to British colonies in Southeast Asia, and the movement of cinchona trees, the source of quinine, from South America to British India, represented the systematic appropriation of indigenous knowledge for imperial profit. The communities that had originally discovered and developed these plants' uses received no benefit from their commercialization. Among the most complex figures in this story of knowledge, preservation and destruction, were the Christian missionaries who followed in the wake of European expansion. These men and women carried with them a burning conviction that they possessed the ultimate truth about human existence, yet many also demonstrated genuine curiosity about the cultures they encountered and made significant contributions to preserving indigenous knowledge, even as they worked to transform the societies that had created it. The Jesuit missions in New France provide a fascinating example of this complexity. Fathers like Jean de Brebeuf and Gabriel Lalemant spent decades living among the Huron people, learning their languages and customs with remarkable thoroughness. Their detailed ethnographic accounts preserve invaluable information about indigenous ways of life that would otherwise have been lost to European diseases and warfare. They documented hunting techniques, agricultural practices, religious ceremonies, and social structures with an attention to detail that would be admired by modern anthropologists. Yet these same missionaries also worked systematically to undermine the very cultural systems they so carefully documented. They established schools designed to separate indigenous children from their traditional upbringing, replacing native languages with French and indigenous spiritual practices with Christian doctrine. The result was a tragic irony. Some of our most detailed records of indigenous North American cultures come from the very people who were working to destroy them. Father Francisco Manas, working among the Maya people of Guatemala in the early 18th century, discovered and translated the Popol Vuh, the great creation epic that represents one of the most sophisticated works of indigenous American literature to survive European contact. Ximenes' translation preserved this masterpiece for posterity, yet he approached it primarily as evidence of the satanic delusions from which he hoped to free the Maya people. He saw his work not as preserving a valuable cultural treasure, but as documenting the false beliefs he was determined to replace with Christian truth. The complexity of missionary attitudes toward indigenous knowledge becomes even more apparent. In the Pacific Islands, where European and American missionaries encountered societies with sophisticated navigational traditions that had allowed Polynesian peoples to traverse vast ocean distances using only their knowledge of stars, currents, and wave patterns. These traditional navigators could sail hundreds of miles across open ocean to find tiny islands, using skills that European sailors found almost miraculous. Some missionaries, particularly those with scientific training, recognized the value of this navigational knowledge and worked to document it. They understood that Polynesian navigation represented a remarkable intellectual achievement that could contribute to human understanding of geography and seamanship. They recorded star charts, interviewed master navigators, and preserved accounts of epic voyages that demonstrated the extent of Polynesian maritime achievement. Yet the same missionaries also introduced new technologies and belief systems that gradually eroded the social structures that had sustained traditional navigation knowledge. Young Polynesians who might have spent years learning to read the ocean's subtle signs instead attended mission schools where they learned European geography and navigation techniques. Within a few generations, much of this traditional knowledge had disappeared, preserved only in the fragmentary accounts recorded by the very people whose activities had contributed to its decline. The story of missionary engagement with indigenous knowledge systems was not uniformly destructive, however. Some religious figures became genuine scholars and preservationists who recognized the value of the traditions they encountered. Frater Bernardino de Sahagún, working in Mexico in the 16th century, spent decades compiling his monumental general history of the things of New Spain, which preserves detailed accounts of Aztec society, religion, medicine, and natural history. Sahagún worked closely with indigenous informants, training them to write in their native languages using the Latin alphabet and encouraging them to preserve their people's traditions in writing. His approach was remarkably ethnographic for its time, and his work provides modern scholars with invaluable insights into pre-Columbian American civilizations. Yet even Sahagún's preservation efforts were motivated by the desire to understand indigenous beliefs well enough to replace them more effectively with Christian doctrine. The Protestant missionary societies that emerged during the Enlightenment often took a different approach, emphasizing education and literacy as tools for spreading Christian truth. The London Missionary Society and similar organizations established schools and printing presses throughout Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, translating the Bible into local languages and teaching indigenous peoples to read and write in their own tongues. This emphasis on literacy had profound and contradictory effects on indigenous knowledge systems. On one hand, it provided communities with new tools for preserving their traditions in written form. Many indigenous languages received their first written alphabets through missionary efforts. and some traditional knowledge that might otherwise have been lost was preserved in the texts that early converts produced. On the other hand, the missionaries' focus on biblical literacy often came at the expense of traditional forms of knowledge transmission. Oral traditions that had preserved historical accounts, genealogies, and practical knowledge for centuries were dismissed as unreliable compared to written texts. Young people who learned to read and write in missionary schools often lost touch with the elders who carried traditional knowledge, creating gaps in cultural transmission that would prove difficult to bridge. As the 18th century progressed, a new consciousness emerged among European intellectuals about the fragility of human knowledge and the urgent need to preserve it for future generations. The philosophes of the French Enlightenment had shown how much could be accomplished by systematically organizing and presenting human understanding. But they had also revealed how much had already been lost to the accidents of history. This realization sparked a new kind of scholarly enterprise, the creation of comprehensive archives, designed to gather and preserve knowledge from every corner of the human experience. The Royal Library of France, under the direction of scholars like Etienne Balouse and later Nicolas Clement, began developing new methods for acquiring, cataloging, and preserving manuscripts from around the world. These librarians understood that their work was not simply about collecting books, but about creating a comprehensive record of human intellectual achievement that could survive the political upheavals and cultural changes that had destroyed so many previous collections. They developed new techniques for manuscript preservation, experimenting with different storage methods and environmental controls that could protect fragile texts from the ravages of time. They created detailed catalogues that would allow future scholars to locate specific information within vast collections. Perhaps most importantly, they began to think systematically about the kinds of knowledge that were most at risk of being lost and the most effective strategies for preserving them. This archival consciousness coincided with the final period of European colonial expansion, creating new opportunities for systematic knowledge gathering on a global scale. Colonial administrators, who might once have ignored indigenous intellectual traditions, now recognized their potential value and began collecting texts, artifacts, and ethnographic information with unprecedented thoroughness. The British East India Company, despite its primary commercial focus, employed scholars like Colin Mackenzie, who spent decades surveying and collecting in South India. Mackenzie's teams of Indian assistants gathered thousands of manuscripts in various regional languages, documented architectural monuments, and recorded oral histories that preserved accounts of local rulers and historical events. His collection, which eventually found its way to the British Museum and the India Office Library, represents one of the most comprehensive attempts to preserve the intellectual heritage of a colonized region. Similar collection efforts took place across the European colonial world. The Dutch colonial government in Indonesia sponsored expeditions to document and collect manuscripts from throughout the archipelago. French officials in North Africa worked with local scholars to preserve Arabic and Berber texts that might otherwise have been lost to political instability. Portuguese administrators in Brazil began documenting indigenous languages and traditions that were rapidly disappearing under the pressure of European settlement. These collection efforts were motivated by a complex mixture of genuine scholarly interest, imperial pride, and practical administrative needs. Colonial governments understood that knowledge of local traditions and social structures could help them govern more effectively, while European scholars recognized that the disruption caused by colonial expansion created a unique opportunity to document cultures that might soon be transformed beyond recognition that the irony was profound. The very forces that were destroying traditional knowledge systems also created the motivation and resources for preserving them in European archives. Indigenous manuscripts that might have continued circulating within their home communities for generations were instead transported to European libraries, where they would be safer from immediate destruction but cut off from the living traditions that gave them meaning. Captain James Cook's voyages in the Pacific illustrate both the promise and the limitations of Enlightenment approaches to knowledge preservation. Cook's expeditions included natural philosophers like Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, who made systematic efforts to document the flora, fauna, and human societies they encountered. They collected thousands of plant specimens, recorded detailed observations of indigenous technologies and social practices, and created ethnographic collections that preserved artifacts representing Pacific Island cultures. Banks, in particular, understood that he was witnessing ways of life that were already beginning to change as a result of European contact. He worked closely with Polynesian informants to understand the function and significance of the objects he collected, and he recorded detailed accounts of traditional practices that he recognized might not survive the disruption of European colonization. Yet, Cook's voyages also initiated the process of change that would ultimately transform the very societies his crew was documenting. The maps and reports they produced opened the Pacific to European settlement and trade, setting in motion cultural changes that would eventually threaten much of the traditional knowledge they had worked to preserve. Their preservation efforts thus became both a record of indigenous achievement and an inadvertent monument to cultural destruction. The growing European awareness of knowledge fragility also led to new international cooperation in preservation efforts. Scholars began corresponding across national boundaries, sharing information about important manuscript discoveries, and coordinating efforts to copy and preserve texts that existed in only a few copies. The Republic of Letters, that informal international community of intellectuals that had emerged during the Renaissance, evolved into a more systematic network for knowledge, preservation, and exchange. German scholars became particularly influential in developing new standards for textual criticism and manuscript analysis. Karl Lockman's work on establishing critical editions of classical texts provided a model that could be applied to manuscripts from any cultural tradition. His methods for comparing different versions of texts and reconstructing original readings helped preserve the authentic content of ancient works, even when the manuscripts themselves were fragmentary or corrupted. These scholarly techniques were gradually applied to texts from around the world, as European Orientalists worked to create critical editions of Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and Chinese classics. The result was a new kind of global intellectual enterprise in which scholars from different countries collaborated to preserve and interpret the written heritage of human civilization. Yet this enterprise remained fundamentally Eurocentric in its assumptions and methods. European scholars assumed that their techniques for analyzing texts were universally applicable, without recognizing that different cultural traditions might have developed their own sophisticated methods for preserving and interpreting written knowledge. Indigenous scholars who had been studying their own traditions for centuries were often treated as informants rather than colleagues, sources of raw information rather than intellectual partners in the preservation effort. The legacy of this period's knowledge preservation efforts remains deeply ambiguous. On one hand, European archives preserved vast amounts of material that might otherwise have been lost to war, natural disaster, or cultural change. Modern scholars studying everything from ancient philosophy to traditional medicine benefit enormously from the collecting efforts of 18th and 19th century Europeans. On the other hand, the extraction of manuscripts and artifacts from their original cultural contexts created new forms of intellectual impoverishment. Communities that had maintained rich traditions of learning for centuries found themselves cut off from their own intellectual heritage, while European institutions became the primary repositories of global human knowledge. The very success of European preservation efforts thus contributed to the cultural dominance that would make it increasingly difficult for non-European knowledge systems to survive and flourish. As the Enlightenment drew to a close and the Industrial Revolution began to transform European society, the stage was set for new forms of knowledge, creation, and destruction that would dwarf even the massive changes of the colonial period. The systematic application of scientific method to industrial production would create unprecedented wealth and power, but it would also establish new hierarchies of knowledge that would further marginalize traditional ways of understanding the world. The story of lost knowledge hidden in plain sight was about to enter its most complex and contradictory chapter. As the modern world began to take shape around the fragments of ancient wisdom that earlier generations had worked so hard to preserve, the thunder of steam engines echoed through valleys that had known only the whisper of wind for millennia, their iron hearts beating against the ancient rhythm of the earth. As the Industrial Revolution unfolded across continents, it brought with it an unexpected treasure trove of forgotten knowledge, buried beneath factory foundations and railway cuttings. The very act of reshaping the landscape revealed secrets that had slumbered in the soil since civilizations lost to memory. In the coal mines of northern England, where miners descended into darkness each dawn, ancient Roman walls emerged from the black earth like ghostly fingers reaching across time. The workers, their faces streaked with coal dust, paused in their labor to marvel at mosaics that had once graced the floors of villas, their tessellated patterns still gleaming beneath the lamplight. These discoveries were more than mere curiosities. They were fragments of a sophisticated understanding of engineering and artistry that challenged the prevailing notion that progress moved only forward, never backward. The great exhibition halls of Victorian England became inadvertent museums of lost knowledge, their iron and glass architecture housing artifacts that spoke of technologies thought impossible for their age. In the Crystal Palace, among the marvels of modern industry, sat ancient Damascus steel blades, whose molecular structure would not be understood until the advent of electron microscopy centuries later. The metal workers of medieval Syria had achieved what industrial chemists struggled to replicate, their knowledge encoded in the very atoms of the metal, waiting for science to catch up to their artistry. Sir Henry Rawlinson, perched on scaffolding against the cliff face of Behistun rock in Persia, chiseled away at inscriptions that would unlock the secrets of cuneiform script. His determination to decode these ancient symbols, driven by the same methodical approach that built the railways and factories of his era, revealed that the Babylonians had possessed mathematical concepts that European scholars believed were their own innovations. The sexagesimal system, with its elegant base 60 structure, had governed Mesopotamian calculations for millennia before finding its way into the measurement of time and angles in the modern world. Meanwhile, in the industrial cities of the Rhine, where the smoke of progress darkened medieval spires, Archaeologists working ahead of railway construction discovered Roman engineering manuals carved in stone. These revealed hydraulic principles that the Romans had mastered and applied to their aqueducts and bathhouses. Knowledge that had been lost during the Dark Ages and was only being rediscovered through trial and error by Victorian engineers. The ancient Romans had understood water pressure, flow dynamics, and thermal efficiency in ways that made their public baths more sophisticated than many contemporary facilities. The expansion of railway networks across Europe and Asia became an unintentional archaeological survey of unprecedented scale. Every cutting through a hill, every foundation dug for a station, revealed layers of human habitation stretching back through ages. In Italy, the construction of the Rome-Florence line uncovered Etruscan tombs filled with artifacts that demonstrated a level of artistic and technological sophistication that had been completely forgotten. The Etruscans had developed dental techniques, including bridges and crowns, that would not be matched again until the Renaissance. Their understanding of metallurgy, revealed in delicate bronze mirrors and jewelry, showed a mastery of alloys that took modern science decades to analyze and understand. The industrial appetite for raw materials drove expeditions to the farthest corners of the earth, and with them came discoveries that challenged European assumptions about the march of civilization. In the forests of Cambodia, French colonial administrators seeking timber for railway ties stumbled upon the temple complex of Angkor Wat, its massive stones carved with astronomical calculations of stunning precision. The Khmer Empire had mapped the movements of planets and stars with an accuracy that rivaled contemporary European observatories, encoding their knowledge in the very architecture of their temples. The precision of Angkor's astronomical alignments revealed that the Khmer had understood precession. The slow wobble of Earth's axis hand had incorporated this knowledge into their religious and architectural planning. Their calendar system, carved in stone, accounted for leap years and seasonal variations with a sophistication that impressed even the most learned European astronomers of the 19th century. The temple complex itself served as a massive, three-dimensional textbook of astronomy, its towers and corridors oriented to mark solstices, equinoxes, and the rising and setting of significant stars. As the British Empire expanded its reach across the globe, its cartographers and surveyors found themselves documenting not just the geography of the present, but the ghostly outlines of vanished civilizations. In India, the Great Trigonometrical Survey, undertaken to map the subcontinent with scientific precision, revealed the remnants of ancient cities whose planning and execution surpassed many contemporary urban centers. The surveyors, working with theodolites and chains across the vast plains, discovered that many of their carefully calculated straight lines followed routes that had been established thousands of years earlier by unknown engineers. The city of Harappa, revealed through these systematic surveys, demonstrated urban planning principles that would not be formally articulated in European architectural theory until the 20th century. Its grid system, sophisticated drainage networks, and standardized building materials spoke of a centralized authority with a deep understanding of public health and urban management. The standardization extended to weights and measures found throughout the Indus Valley civilization, revealing a level of commercial and administrative coordination that spanned hundreds of miles. Most remarkably, the Harappan civilization had developed a writing system that remained tantalizingly undeciphered, even as industrial-age scholars applied the same methodical approaches that had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform. The seals bearing these mysterious symbols were found in archaeological layers that predated the rise of classical Greece and Rome, suggesting that literacy and complex record-keeping had emerged independently in multiple centers of human civilization. In Egypt, the construction of the Suez Canal became an inadvertent exercise in archaeology as massive earth-moving operations revealed layer upon layer of human habitation. The French engineers, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, found themselves constantly consulting with archaeologists as their excavations uncovered temples, workshops, and residential quarters that told the story of Egypt's long history as a crossroads of trade and culture. The canal cutting revealed that the ancient Egyptians had themselves attempted similar engineering projects, with evidence of earlier canal systems that had connected the Red Sea to the Mediterranean through the Nile Delta. The papyrus documents found in these excavations included mathematical treatises that demonstrated the Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of geometry and engineering. The Moscow Mathematical Papyrus and the Rind Mathematical Papyrus revealed that Egyptian mathematicians had developed formulas for calculating the volume of truncated pyramids and the area of circles using approximations of pi that were remarkably accurate for their time. Their knowledge of optics, revealed in the precision ground lenses found in tombs, suggested that they had developed technologies for magnification and precise observation that would not be reinvented in Europe until the medieval period. The Industrial Revolution's hunger for antiquities, driven by wealthy collectors and national museums, led to the systematic exploration of Egypt's monuments and tombs. The decipherment of the Rosetta Stone by Jean-Francois Champollion opened a window into Egyptian thought that revealed not just historical records, but scientific and medical knowledge of extraordinary sophistication. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, discovered during this period, contained surgical procedures and anatomical observations that demonstrated a level of medical knowledge that would not be surpassed until the modern era. Egyptian physicians had identified the brain as the center of thought and motor control, performed cataract surgery, and developed antibiotics derived from bread, mold anticipating by millennia. Discoveries that 19th century doctors believed were revolutionary. Their understanding of the circulatory system, evident in medical papyri, was more accurate than European medical knowledge well into the Renaissance. The preservation techniques they developed for mummification revealed a sophisticated understanding of chemistry and decomposition that informed modern preservation science. The Industrial Age's improvements in transportation and communication allowed for the archaeological discoveries, creating a global community of scholars who could compare and contrast findings from different continents. The realization that advanced mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge had emerged independently in multiple civilizations challenged the linear narrative of progress that had dominated European thought. Instead, it suggested that human knowledge followed cycles of discovery, loss, and rediscovery that transcended individual cultures and time periods. The Industrial Revolution brought with it new tools of analysis that could peer into the very structure of ancient artifacts, revealing secrets that had been invisible to previous generations of scholars. The development of chemical analysis in the 19th century allowed scientists to examine the composition of ancient alloys, pigments, and materials with unprecedented precision. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about technological development and the supposed primitive nature of pre-industrial societies. Roman concrete, analyzed through these new chemical techniques, proved to be a marvel of engineering that in many ways surpassed modern materials. The volcanic ash that Romans incorporated into their concrete created a chemical reaction that actually strengthened the material over time. Unlike modern concrete, which deteriorates, this self-healing property explained why Roman structures, like the Pantheon and the Colosseum, had survived nearly 2 millennia, while modern concrete buildings showed signs of decay within decades. The Romans had achieved this through empirical observation and experimentation, developing a technology that would not be fully understood until the advent of electron microscopy. Similarly, analysis of ancient steel revealed that medieval Islamic metallurgists had developed techniques for creating wootz steel that incorporated carbon nanotubes, structures that would not be formally identified and synthesized until the late 20th century. The Damascus steel produced from wootz ore displayed properties of strength and flexibility that remained unmatched until the development of modern alloy steels. The knowledge of how to create these materials had been lost during the colonial period, when traditional craft guilds were disrupted by European trading companies in the Americas, where industrial expansion brought systematic archaeological investigation. The sophisticated knowledge systems of indigenous peoples began to be documented and understood. The agricultural techniques of the Inca, revealed through careful study of their terraced mountainsides, demonstrated a level of ecological understanding that anticipated many principles of modern sustainable farming. Their system of crop rotation, soil management, and water conservation had supported a population density in the Andes that would not be matched again until the 20th century. The Inca had developed a complex system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipus, which served as both accounting ledgers and historical chronicles, while the symbolic system remained largely undeciphered. The mathematical precision of the knots and their spatial relationships suggested a form of three-dimensional writing that could encode numerical, categorical, and narrative information in a single artifact. The quipu represented a completely different approach to information storage that challenged Western assumptions about literacy and record-keeping. Mayan astronomical knowledge, preserved in their codices and carved into their monuments, revealed calculations of planetary cycles that were more accurate than contemporary European observations. The Mayan understanding of the synodic period of Venus differed from European measurements by only a few hours over a cycle of several years. Their calendar system incorporated multiple interlocking cycles that tracked not just solar and lunar movements, but the complex interactions between various planetary bodies. This astronomical knowledge was integrated into their agricultural practices, religious ceremonies, and architectural planning in ways that demonstrated a holistic understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos. The development of photography during the Industrial Age created an unprecedented record of archaeological discoveries and ancient knowledge systems that might otherwise have been lost to later destruction or neglect. The earliest archaeological photographs captured details of inscriptions, architectural features, and artifact arrangements that proved invaluable to later scholars. These photographic records preserved information about contexts and relationships that written descriptions alone could not convey. In China, where industrial modernization began later but proceeded rapidly, the systematic cataloging of ancient texts revealed the sophisticated scientific traditions that had developed independently of European influence. Chinese scholars had documented observations of supernovas, comets, and solar eclipses with remarkable consistency over more than 2 millennia, creating astronomical records that proved invaluable to modern astrophysicists studying long-term celestial phenomena. Their understanding of magnetism, demonstrated in the compass and magnetic declination, had enabled navigation technologies that reached Europe through trade routes spanning continents. Traditional Chinese medicine, when subjected to modern analytical techniques, revealed pharmacological knowledge that had been developed through centuries of empirical observation and systematic testing. Compounds derived from traditional herbal preparations proved to have genuine therapeutic effects that could be explained through modern biochemistry. The Chinese understanding of circulation, documented in texts predating European medical knowledge by centuries, described systems of energy flow that, while expressed in different conceptual frameworks, often corresponded to demonstrable physiological processes. The 20th century brought revolutionary new tools and methodologies to the study of ancient knowledge, transforming archaeology from treasure hunting into a rigorous science. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the aftermath of atomic research, provided precise chronologies that revolutionized understanding of human development and cultural exchange. Sites that had been assumed to be contemporaneous proved to be separated by millennia, while others thought to be ancient showed evidence of much more recent occupation and use. The application of scientific methodology to archaeological investigation revealed that many sites contained multiple layers of occupation, with later civilizations building upon and incorporating the knowledge of their predecessors. At Troy, the systematic excavation, pioneered by Heinrich Schliemann and refined by his successors, revealed 9 distinct cities built one upon another, each representing different periods of technological and cultural development. The continuity of occupation suggested that knowledge was preserved and transmitted across cultural transitions that had previously been understood as complete breaks with the past. Aerial photography, initially developed for military reconnaissance, opened entirely new perspectives on ancient landscapes and revealed patterns invisible from ground level. The crop marks visible from aircraft exposed the outlines of buried structures, field systems, and settlement patterns that demonstrated the sophisticated land management practices of ancient peoples. In Britain, aerial surveys revealed that the landscape had been systematically organized and managed for thousands of years, with evidence of field boundaries, trackways, and settlement hierarchies that suggested complex social and economic systems. The development of underwater archaeology expanded the scope of investigation to include the vast repositories of knowledge preserved in shipwrecks and submerged settlements. The Mediterranean, with its thousands of ancient wrecks, became a library of maritime technology and trade relationships that spanned millennia. The preservation conditions underwater had maintained organic materials that were rarely found in terrestrial sites, providing insights into ancient textiles, foodstuffs, and wooden technologies that filled crucial gaps in understanding. The Bronze Age shipwreck discovered off Uluburan, Turkey, contained a cargo that testified to a complex international trade network linking Africa, Asia, and Europe. The ship carried copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic, and glass beads from Mesopotamia. This single vessel demonstrated that sophisticated systems of international commerce, navigation, and cultural exchange had existed more than 3 millennia ago, challenging assumptions about the isolation and primitive nature of Bronze Age societies. Ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical survey techniques allowed archaeologists to map subsurface features without excavation, preserving sites while revealing their structure and organization. These non-invasive methods showed that many ancient sites were far larger and more complex than surface remains suggested. The application of these techniques to known sites often revealed that they were parts of much larger complexes that had been connected by roads, waterways, and other infrastructure systems. Remote sensing technology, developed initially for geological and military purposes, found new applications in revealing hidden aspects of ancient landscapes. Satellite imagery could detect subtle variations in soil moisture and vegetation that marked the locations of buried walls, roads, and field systems. LiDAR technology, which used laser pulses to create detailed topographical maps, could penetrate forest canopies to reveal the remains of ancient cities and ceremonial complexes that had been completely overgrown by vegetation. The application of computer modeling and simulation to archaeological data enabled researchers to test hypotheses about ancient technologies and social systems in ways that had never been possible before. Virtual reconstructions of ancient buildings allowed architects and engineers to analyze their structural principles and understand how they had been constructed without the benefit of modern tools and machinery. These models often revealed ingenious solutions to engineering problems that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of physics and material science. The study of ancient DNA, extracted from human remains and artifacts, opened entirely new avenues for understanding ancient populations and their knowledge systems. Genetic analysis revealed patterns of migration, trade, and cultural exchange that were invisible in the archaeological record alone. The preservation of plant and animal DNA in ancient contexts provided evidence of agricultural practices, dietary systems, and ecological management that had sustained complex civilizations for centuries or millennia. Isotope analysis of ancient materials revealed information about trade routes, agricultural practices, and environmental conditions that had shaped the development of ancient knowledge systems. The chemical signatures preserved in bones, teeth, and artifacts could trace the geographical origins of individuals and materials with remarkable precision, creating detailed maps of ancient mobility and exchange networks that spanned continents. As the 21st century dawned, the pace of archaeological discovery accelerated dramatically. New sites were being discovered and investigated at an unprecedented rate, while new analytical techniques continued to reveal previously hidden aspects of known sites and artifacts. The cumulative effect of these discoveries was a fundamental transformation in understanding of human history and the development of knowledge systems that had shaped civilizations across the globe. The emerging picture was one of human knowledge as a complex web of discovery, transmission, loss, and rediscovery that transcended individual cultures and historical periods. Rather than a linear progression from primitive to sophisticated, the archaeological record revealed cycles of advancement and decline, innovation and preservation, that suggested knowledge itself was more resilient and more widely distributed than had ever been imagined. The lost knowledge hidden in plain sight was not simply waiting to be rediscovered. It was actively shaping the modern world in ways that were only beginning to be understood. In laboratories around the world, scientists continued to analyze ancient artifacts with ever more sophisticated techniques, each new method revealing additional layers of information about the knowledge and skills of past civilizations. The boundaries between archaeology, history, and science continued to blur as researchers recognized that understanding the past required integrating evidence from multiple disciplines and methodologies. The quest to uncover lost knowledge had become a collaborative enterprise that spanned institutions, nations, and academic disciplines. The digital revolution began to transform how archaeological information was recorded, stored, and shared, creating vast databases of knowledge that could be accessed and analyzed by researchers around the world. Virtual museums and online archives made previously inaccessible collections available to scholars and the public, democratizing access to humanity's archaeological heritage in unprecedented ways. The 21st century dawned with humanity possessing tools their ancestors could scarcely have imagined in the sky that could peer through time itself. Algorithms that could decipher languages dead for millennia, and digital archives that promised to preserve knowledge for eternity. Yet even as these technological marvels revealed secrets buried for thousands of years, they also highlighted a sobering truth. The cycle of knowledge, lost and found, was not a relic of the past, but an eternal rhythm that continued to pulse through human civilization in the quiet hours before dawn. When the world held its breath between night and day, satellites traced their silent paths across the heavens. These mechanical sentinels, equipped with sensors more sensitive than any human eye, began to reveal landscapes hidden beneath the surface of time. Through the gentle art of remote sensing, archaeologists discovered that the Earth itself was a vast palimpsest, its surface bearing the faint impressions of countless civilizations that had risen, flourished, and faded into memory. Dr. Sarah Popcak, seated in her laboratory at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, watched as thermal, infrared images slowly assembled themselves on her screen. The data, collected by satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above the Nile Delta, revealed patterns invisible to the naked isotopic variations in soil composition that marked the presence of ancient walls, buried streets, and forgotten temples. Here, hidden beneath the modern landscape of Egypt, lay the ghost of Tanis, the lost capital of the pharaohs, its outlines emerging like a photograph developing in slow motion. The satellite did not see these structures as human eyes might. Instead, it detected the whispered differences in how buried stone and brick retained and released heat compared to the surrounding earth. Plants grew differently above ancient walls, their roots finding less purchase in the compacted soil where foundations lay buried. These subtle signatures, imperceptible to ground-based observers, created a thermal map of the past that revealed entire cities lost to time as the images processed, revealing the geometric patterns of streets laid out. 3,000 years ago, Dr. Parcock reflected on the profound irony of her work. She was using technology that would have seemed like magic to the ancient builders whose creations she sought. Yet the knowledge these structures contained, their astronomical alignments, their sophisticated understanding of hydraulics and urban planning, their artistic achievements often surpassed modern understanding. The satellites could find the cities, but deciphering their secrets still required the patient work of human minds in the hushed halls of Google's headquarters in Mountain View, California. A different kind of archaeological revolution was unfolding. Computer scientists and linguists worked together in an unlikely partnership, training artificial intelligence systems to read languages that had been silent for millennia. The project began with a simple question: if machines could learn to translate between living languages, could they also bridge the gap between the past and present? Dr. Zhoming Luo fed thousands of images of Akkadian cuneiform tablets into a neural network, watching as the algorithm slowly learned to recognize the wedge-shaped marks that had once recorded the daily business of ancient Mesopotamia. The machine did not understand the meaning of these symbols, at least not in any human sense, but it began to recognize patterns, the way certain combinations of marks appeared together, how the writing style evolved over centuries. The mathematical relationships between symbols that might indicate grammatical structures. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening in October, when the algorithm successfully identified a previously unknown variant of the Epic of Gilgamesh, embedded within what had been catalogued as a mundane administrative text. The discovery sent ripples through the academic world, not merely because of what it revealed about ancient literature, but because of what it suggested about the vast repositories of knowledge still waiting to be unlocked in university basements and museum storage rooms around the world. Hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, papyrus fragments, and stone inscriptions sat untranslated, their secrets locked away simply because there were not enough scholars with the necessary linguistic skills to read them all. The digital age promised to democratize this ancient knowledge, making it possible for machines to perform the initial work of pattern recognition and basic translation, freeing human scholars to focus on interpretation and understanding. Yet even as these technological tools opened new windows into the past, they also revealed the fragility of digital knowledge itself. The Internet, for all its apparent permanence, proved to be as ephemeral as any ancient library. Websites vanished without warning, their content lost when servers failed or companies changed hands. Digital formats became obsolete, leaving files as unreadable as linear A. The very technology that promised to preserve human knowledge for eternity was itself subject to the same forces of decay and forgetting that had claimed so. Many treasures of the past, recognizing this new vulnerability, a dedicated community of digital preservationists emerged, working tirelessly to ensure that humanity's accumulated knowledge would not suffer the same fate as the Library of Alexandria. In San Francisco, the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine quietly captured billions of web pages, creating a vast digital fossil record of human thought and communication. Meanwhile, in a climate-controlled facility in Norway, the Global Seed Vault expanded its mission beyond agricultural preservation to include digital seeds copies of essential software, databases, and digital documents that future generations might need to understand their past. Cole Brewster, working late in the Internet Archive's scanning center, carefully positioned another volume of 19th century scientific journals under the high-resolution camera. Each page was photographed multiple times, the images processed and stored in multiple formats across geographically distributed servers. This was not merely digitization, it was an act of cultural preservation as urgent and important as any. Archaeological excavation, the books he scanned contained knowledge that had once seemed cutting edge, but was now largely forgotten. Detailed observations of natural phenomena that predated modern scientific instruments. Innovative engineering solutions developed before the age of computer-aided design. Medical treatments that had been abandoned but might hold insights for future researchers. By digitizing these volumes, the archive was creating a bridge between past and future, ensuring that knowledge deemed obsolete by one generation might be rediscovered and recontextualized by another. Yet the challenge of digital preservation extended far beyond simply scanning old books. As society became increasingly dependent on digital technologies, vast amounts of human knowledge existed only in electronic form: scientific databases, social media conversations, email correspondence, and digital art. This born digital content was particularly vulnerable to loss, as it required constant migration between storage formats and systems to remain accessible. The Library of Congress, recognizing this challenge, embarked on an ambitious project to preserve Twitter's entire public archive: billions of tweets that represented a real-time record of human thought and conversation from the early 21st century. Critics questioned the value of preserving such ephemeral communications, but historians understood that these digital fragments might prove as valuable to future scholars as the letters and diaries of previous centuries had been to understanding the past. As artificial intelligence systems grew more sophisticated, they began to exhibit an unexpected characteristic. They started to rediscover knowledge that humans had forgotten. Machine learning algorithms, trained on vast datasets of historical information, identified patterns that had escaped human notice: connections between seemingly unrelated historical events, linguistic influences that had been overlooked by traditional scholarship, and mathematical relationships hidden within ancient texts. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a team of researchers, led by Dr. Regina Barsley, developed an algorithm that could analyze the chemical composition of ancient texts, identifying the geographic origins of papyrus and parchment with unprecedented accuracy. This seemingly technical achievement opened new avenues for understanding the movement of knowledge in the ancient world, revealing previously unknown trade routes and cultural exchanges that had shaped human intellectual development. The algorithms analysis of medieval manuscripts revealed that knowledge had flowed along far more complex pathways than previously understood. Texts that scholars had assumed were copied in European scriptoriums showed chemical signatures indicating they had been prepared in North Africa or the Middle East. This discovery painted a picture of medieval scholarship as a truly international enterprise, with ideas and techniques flowing freely across religious and cultural boundaries, even during periods of supposed isolation and conflict. Yet perhaps the most profound discovery came from an unexpected source: video game players. When researchers at the University of Washington created a game called Foldit, which challenged players to predict protein structures, they unwittingly tapped into the collective problem-solving capabilities of hundreds of thousands of minds. The players, working individually but connected through the game's online platform, began solving complex biochemical puzzles that had baffled professional scientists for years. One particularly challenging problem involved the structure of an enzyme related to HIV infection, a puzzle that had remained unsolved for over 15 years. Within just 10 days of its release in the game, players had determined the correct protein structure, providing crucial insights for potential drug development. The solution came not from any single brilliant mind, but from the collective intelligence of the gaming community, each player contributing small insights that, when aggregated, revealed the larger truth. As the digital age matured, new forms of hidden knowledge began to emerge. social media platforms accumulated vast databases of human behavior and communication, creating unprecedented opportunities for understanding social dynamics, cultural evolution, and collective decision-making. Yet much of this knowledge remained locked away in corporate servers, accessible only to those with the technical expertise and legal authority to analyze it. Dr. Zeynep Tufekci, observing the flow of information during social movements around the world, recognized that platforms like Twitter and Facebook had become unwitting repositories of human knowledge about collective action, social organization, and cultural change. The patterns of information spread during protests revealed ancient truths about how ideas move through societies, while the network structures of online communities echoed organizational principles that could be traced back to tribal societies and medieval guilds. Yet accessing this knowledge required navigating a complex landscape of privacy concerns, corporate interests, and technical barriers. The algorithms that governed these platforms were themselves forms of hidden knowledge, sophisticated systems that shaped human behavior and cultural development, yet remained largely opaque to outside scrutiny. These digital black boxes represented a new category of lost knowledge, created and controlled by a small number of technology companies, but affecting the lives of billions of people. In response to these challenges, a movement emerged to create open-source alternatives, platforms, and tools designed to preserve and democratize access to digital knowledge. Wikipedia stood as the most successful example of this approach, demonstrating that collaborative knowledge creation could rival or exceed the quality of traditional expert-driven encyclopedias. The site's edit history became a fascinating record of how human knowledge evolved in real time, with each article serving as a microcosm of scholarly debate and consensus building. The Wikipedia project also revealed something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. It was not a fixed collection of facts, but a living, evolving conversation between minds across time and space. The platform's discussion pages captured this process in unprecedented detail, showing how contributors from different backgrounds and cultures negotiated shared understanding of complex topics. In many ways, Wikipedia had recreated the collaborative spirit of ancient centers of learning like the House of Wisdom, but on a global scale. As researchers delved deeper into the digital age's archaeological treasures, they began to recognize patterns that stretched across millennia. The same themes that had driven ancient scholars: the desire to understand the natural world, to preserve knowledge for future generations, to solve practical problems through innovation, continued to motivate their modern counterparts. The tools had evolved, but the fundamental human drive to learn, discover, and share knowledge remained constant. Dr. Michael McCormick, analyzing vast databases of historical climate data, discovered that periods of knowledge flourishing often coincided with optimal environmental conditions. The Islamic Golden Age had thrived during a period of stable climate that supported agricultural prosperity and urban growth. The Renaissance had emerged as Europe recovered from the climatic disruptions of the late medieval period. Even the digital revolution had accelerated during a period of relative environmental stability in the late 20th century. This pattern suggested that knowledge, preservation, and creation were intimately connected to the material conditions of human existence. When societies had surplus resources and stable conditions, they could invest in scholarship, artistic creation, and technological innovation. When these conditions deteriorated, knowledge was often the first casualty, as immediate survival took precedence over long-term intellectual development. The implications of this pattern were sobering for the digital age. As climate change began to stress global systems and political instability increased around the world, the conditions that had enabled the information revolution were starting to erode. Power grids failed more frequently, disrupting data centers. Political conflicts led to internet censorship and the destruction of digital infrastructure. Economic inequality limited access to education and technology for vast populations. Yet even as these challenges mounted, new forms of knowledge preservation emerged. Blockchain technologies promised to create truly distributed and censorship-resistant archives. Mesh networks allowed communities to maintain local internet connectivity even when centralized infrastructure failed. Offline-first software designs ensured that essential knowledge remained accessible even without constant internet connectivity. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery of the digital age was that the ancient dream of universal knowledge, the vision, that had driven Ptolemy I to create the Library of Alexandria, that had inspired medieval scholars to compile vast encyclopedias, that had motivated Enlightenment thinkers to create systematic catalogues of human learning was finally within reach. The internet had become something approaching Borges' infinite library, containing virtually all of human knowledge and then some. Yet this achievement brought its own challenges. The sheer volume of available information created new forms of ignorance, the inability to find relevant knowledge amid the vast sea of data. The difficulty of distinguishing reliable sources from misinformation. The tendency for algorithms to create filter bubbles that limited intellectual exploration. Paradoxically, the age of universal access to information had also become an age of widespread intellectual confusion and polarization. Dr. Cathy O'Neill, studying the mathematics of algorithmic decision-making, recognized that the artificial intelligence systems designed to help humans navigate this information landscape were themselves encoding hidden forms of knowledge and bias. The recommendation algorithms that determined what information people saw were shaped by training data that reflected historical patterns of inequality and discrimination. In trying to solve the problem of information overload, these systems were inadvertently perpetuating and amplifying existing forms of social knowledge, including knowledge that societies might have preferred to leave in the past. This realization led to a new understanding of what it meant for knowledge to be hidden in plain sight in the digital age. The most important secrets were not locked away in forgotten archives or buried beneath ancient ruins, but embedded in the algorithms and systems that shaped daily life. The code that determined search results, the parameters that controlled social media feeds, the data models that influenced hiring decisions, these represented new forms of esoteric, knowledge that affected millions of people while remaining largely invisible to public scrutiny. Efforts to illuminate these hidden systems through algorithmic auditing, data visualization, and explainable AI research represented a new form of archaeological investigation. Just as Heinrich Schliemann had excavated Troy layer by layer, revealing the accumulated history of human settlement, modern researchers were excavating the layers of algorithmic decision-making, revealing the hidden assumptions and biases that shaped contemporary society as the 21st century progressed. Patterns that had repeated throughout human history began to manifest once again in digital form. Just as ancient civilizations had experienced cycles of centralization and fragmentation, the internet evolved from a decentralized network to a system dominated by a few large platforms, and then began to fragment again as concerns about privacy and control led to the development of alternative networks and protocols. The phenomenon of digital dark ages, periods when technological change rendered older formats unreadable, mirrored the way that changes in language and writing systems had made ancient texts incomprehensible to later generations. NASA discovered this firsthand when trying to access data from 1970s space missions, finding that the magnetic tapes were physically intact, but the computers and software needed to read them no longer existed. This experience led to a deeper appreciation for the maintenance work that knowledge preservation required. It was not enough to simply store information. It required active curation, regular migration between formats, and the preservation of the tools and expertise needed to access it. The same challenges that medieval monasteries had faced in copying manuscripts before they decayed now applied to digital preservation, requiring constant vigilance and resources to maintain humanity's accumulated knowledge. Dr. Vint Cerf, one of the architects of the Internet, became an unlikely champion of digital preservation, warning that future historians might find the early 21st century to be a digital dark age. Despite being the most information-rich period in human history, his concerns proved prescient as early websites became inaccessible. Social media platforms changed or disappeared, and digital art installations stopped functioning as their underlying technologies became obsolete. Yet the digital age also revealed new forms of resilience in human knowledge systems. When traditional institutions failed, communities often found ways to preserve and share knowledge through informal networks. When academic journals became too expensive for many libraries to access, scientists created open-access repositories. When governments censored information, citizens developed tools for circumventing restrictions and preserving evidence of historical events. One of the most significant developments of the digital age was the emergence of hybrid human-machine, intelligent systems that could tackle problems beyond the capabilities of either humans or computers alone. These systems revealed hidden knowledge by combining human creativity and intuition with machine processing power and pattern recognition abilities. The citizen science movement demonstrated this potential on a massive scale. Projects like Galaxy, Zoo enlisted hundreds of thousands of volunteers to classify astronomical images. eBird mobilized birdwatchers to create comprehensive databases of species distribution. And Transcribe Bentham invited the public to help transcribe the handwritten manuscripts of the 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Each project revealed knowledge that had been hidden not because it was secret or lost, but simply because no single institution had the resources to process and analyze it. The success of these collaborative projects suggested that the future of knowledge discovery lay not in replacing human intelligence with artificial intelligence, but in creating new forms of partnership between human and machine capabilities. Humans excelled at recognizing patterns that didn't fit standard categories, at understanding context and meaning, and at making creative leaps that connected disparate pieces of information. Machines excelled at processing vast amounts of data, identifying subtle statistical patterns, and performing repetitive tasks with consistent accuracy. Dr. Louise Vaughan, creator of several innovative crowdsourcing platforms, recognized that these human-machine partnerships could tackle problems that had persisted for centuries. His Reis APTCHA system, originally designed to distinguish humans from computer programs, was repurposed to digitize old books and newspapers by asking users to transcribe words that optical character recognition software couldn't read accurately. Millions of people, simply by proving they were human when logging into websites, collectively digitized entire libraries without even realizing they were doing so. This human computation approach revealed that valuable work could be accomplished by distributing small tasks across large networks of people, each contributing just a few minutes of effort. The model was reminiscent of the way medieval manuscripts had been copied by networks of scribes, each adding their small contribution to the preservation of human knowledge, but scaled up to include potentially anyone with internet access. As traditional archaeological sites became increasingly well documented and accessible through digital technologies, archaeologists began to turn their attention to new frontiers. Urban archaeology, the investigation of buried layers beneath modern cities, revealed that human settlements were palimpsests of continuous occupation, with each generation building upon the ruins of the last. Cities like London, Rome, and Istanbul became vertical time machines, their foundations reaching back thousands of years. Digital archaeology emerged as a distinct discipline, focused on preserving and interpreting the massive amounts of data generated by contemporary society. Social media posts, email archives, and digital photographs created unprecedented documentation of daily life, but this material required new methodologies for collection, analysis, and interpretation. Future archaeologists would have access to more information about early 21st century life than had been available for any previous period in human history. Yet they would also face the challenge of processing and making sense of this overwhelming abundance of data. Dr. Cornelius Holthoff, studying the archaeology of the digital age, proposed that traditional notions of archaeological sites and artifacts needed to be expanded to include virtual spaces and digital objects. Online communities developed their own cultures, languages, and historical narratives that were as worthy of preservation and study as any physical civilization. Virtual worlds like Second Life and World of Warcraft became archaeological sites in their own right, documenting human creativity, social organization, and cultural evolution in digital environments. The concept of space archaeology gained momentum as satellite technology improved and space exploration expanded. Dr. Alice Gorman pioneered the study of space heritage, documenting the artifacts of human space exploration from the lunar to crash site on the Moon to the Voyager spacecraft, traveling beyond the solar system. These objects represented a new category of archaeological, material human artifacts in environments where no human had ever been, carrying messages and symbols intended for civilizations that might not encounter them for millions of years. Meanwhile, underwater archaeology revealed vast new territories for exploration as rising sea levels made previously terrestrial sites accessible to marine investigation. Coastal settlements that had been abandoned thousands of years ago as ice ages ended and sea levels rose were rediscovered by diving archaeologists. Their preservation in underwater environments often superior to that of sites exposed to air. And whether, as humanity gained the ability to see further into the past through improved archaeological techniques, and to project further into the future through computational modeling, a new perspective on knowledge and civilization began to emerge. The long now foundation, established to encourage long-term thinking, began construction of a 10,000-year clock designed to operate for 10 millennia, serving as a monument to the possibility of extended human presence on Earth. This long-term perspective revealed that many of the knowledge crises that seemed urgent and unprecedented were actually part of recurring patterns that operated on timescales longer than human memory. Climate changes that appeared sudden from a human perspective were part of long-term cycles that had shaped human civilization for millennia. Technologies that seemed revolutionary were often rediscoveries or new applications of principles that had been understood and forgotten multiple times throughout history. Dr. Stuart Brand, reflecting on decades of technological change, observed that layers of civilization operated at different speeds. Fashion and pop culture changed rapidly, while deeper structures like language, religion, and governance evolved much more slowly. Knowledge, he realized, was subject to similar layering effects. Surface knowledge, facts, and techniques that were widely known and easily transmitted could disappear quickly when conditions changed. But deeper knowledge, fundamental principles, and ways of thinking persisted across much longer timescales, often surviving periods of apparent loss to re-emerge in new forms. This understanding led to new approaches to knowledge preservation that focused not just on storing information, but on maintaining the cultural and institutional frameworks needed to interpret and apply it. The survival of knowledge required not just libraries and databases, but communities of practice that kept traditions alive through continuous use and adaptation. Indigenous communities around the world demonstrated this principle through their maintenance of traditional ecological knowledge, sophisticated understanding of local environments that had been developed and refined over thousands of years. This knowledge was not stored in books or databases, but embedded in languages, stories, ceremonies, and practices that connected each generation to the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. As the digital age matured and new challenges emerged, humanity began to recognize that the story of lost and found knowledge was not a linear progression toward greater understanding, but a spiral that returned to familiar themes at ever higher levels of complexity. Each generation rediscovered fundamental truths about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between knowledge and power, but in contexts shaped by new technologies and circumstances. The algorithms that govern social media, recommendation systems, for example, were sophisticated implementations of ancient principles of rhetoric and persuasion that had been understood by Greek philosophers and medieval scholars. The filter bubbles and echo chambers that characterized online discourse were digital manifestations of the same tribal loyalties and confirmation biases that had shaped human societies since the beginning of recorded history. Yet the digital age also offered unprecedented opportunities for breaking out of these recurring patterns. Global communication networks made it possible for knowledge to be preserved in multiple locations simultaneously, reducing the risk of catastrophic loss. Machine translation began to break down language barriers that had historically limited the flow of knowledge between cultures. Open access publishing challenged traditional gatekeeping mechanisms that had restricted access to scholarly information. Dr. Sherry Turkle, studying the psychological effects of digital technology, observed that each new communication medium prompted a rediscovery of fundamental questions about human connection, identity, and community. The rise of social media led to renewed interest in ancient philosophical questions about the nature of friendship, authenticity, and the examined life. Virtual reality technologies prompted reconsideration of centuries-old debates about the relationship between perception and reality. As artificial intelligence systems became more sophisticated, they began to exhibit behaviors that recalled ancient stories about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, creation and responsibility. The development of AI raised questions that had been explored in myth and literature for millennia. What did it mean to create intelligence? What responsibilities did creators have toward their creations? And what happened when artificial beings began to exceed their maker's understanding and control? In the quiet moments between technological upheavals, when the urgent demands of innovation paused and humanity could reflect on the deeper patterns of change, it became clear that the most important knowledge was not technical or factual, but experiential and relational. The wisdom traditions that had emerged from every human culture shared common insights about the importance of balance, humility, and connection to something larger than individual existence. These insights could not be digitized or algorithmed, though they could be expressed through digital media. They required direct experience, contemplation, and the slow work of integrating understanding into lived practice. They were hidden in plain sight, not because they were secret, but because they could only be recognized by minds prepared to receive them through their own journey of learning and growth. As night fell over the digital landscape, as servers hummed quietly in data centers around the world, as satellites traced their silent orbits overhead, the ancient work of preserving and transmitting human knowledge continued. Each click, each search, each moment of connection across the network was part of a vast collaborative effort that stretched back to the first humans who shared stories around fires, and forward to future generations who would inherit both the wisdom and the challenges of their predecessors. The knowledge hidden in plain sight was not a treasure to be found once and possessed forever, but a living stream that flowed through time, carrying the hopes and discoveries of each generation to the next. Those who learned to see this flow, to contribute to it, and to draw wisdom from it would find themselves part of a conversation that began with the first human words and would continue as long as consciousness sought to understand itself and its place in the vast mystery of existence. In the end, the greatest knowledge hidden in plain sight was perhaps the simplest and most profound, that every moment offered an opportunity to learn, to grow, to connect with others, and to contribute something valuable to the endless human story. This knowledge required no special technology to access, no advanced degree to understand, no institutional permission to apply. It was available to anyone willing to approach life with curiosity, humility, and an open heart. And so the spiral continued, each turn revealing new vistas while returning to eternal themes. Each generation discovering anew that the most important treasures were those that could be shared without being diminished, that grew stronger when given away, and that remained forever hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes willing to see and hearts prepared to understand. If this journey through the hidden knowledge of humanity has gently moved you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. Sweet dreams, fellow seekers of wisdom, until our paths cross again in the realm of forgotten stories and rediscovered truths.